Good day, everyone. Welcome to another Live with Kevin, which will eventually, if you've been here before, you know that eventually it will become another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're here live, do me a favor. Well, do yourself a favor. Go into the comment section, whatever platform you happen to be watching this stream on, and say hello. Tell us where you're located. That's actually beneficial to me. It's also beneficial to you because it gets you used to using your fingers. Because imagine that you were joining my guest and I around a table, as she said to me a minute ago, having a cup of coffee, or if it was later in the day, perhaps a different beverage. If you were sitting around the table with us, if you had a question or a comment or an idea, you would share it, right? So why not do that here? If you have a question, a comment, an idea, share it, offer it, and you do that with your fingers by going into the chat function of whatever platform you're on to do that. When you do that, you will be more engaged. We'll make this more valuable for you. I'll be happy, but most of all, it will also make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast. You see it up over my shoulder. Eventually this will be on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And so given that, now that I've said hello to all of you, let me do the intro for the podcast itself. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. We talk about wanting more innovation, yet the level of our innovation often leaves us wanting more of it. Why is it that we don't get the levels of innovation that we claim we want? It's an important question that we will answer today. We'll help you see what the barriers to that, why that gap occurs, and more importantly, how to overcome them. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we're helping leaders and organizations like you and yours be more effective, more confident, and get better results. That's why we're here. That's why I hope that you're here. And so I hope that if you are listening to this, you'll say, this is something I'd like more of, which means you might want to get it earlier, which I need to tell you that these episodes are initially live streamed. In this case, about 7 weeks before you're getting the chance to hear it. So if you want to be on the inside, if you want to get the inside track, if you want to get this information sooner and sort of be a part of the show in a different sort of way, just make sure you connect with us on LinkedIn or Facebook, 2 of the places where we do these live streams. And so you can learn more and get connected there by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Pretty straightforward. If you like what you're hearing today and you want help developing the leaders in your organization, we should definitely talk. And the best way to do that is to reach out to us to info@kevinikenberry.com. And when you do that, we'll schedule a time to learn more about what your needs are and how we might be able to help. So with that, I'm going to bring in our guest, and you'll have way more enjoyment by not just having Kevin. Lorraine Marchand is my guest today. She's a consultant, author, and educator on innovation. She has extensive experience in new product development. She's co-founded several startups, held leadership positions at companies including Bristol Myers Squibb, Covance LabCorp, and IBM. And she served as an advisor to both Johnson & Johnson and Hewlett-Packard. She is an author with John Hance of The Innovation Mindset, 8 Essential Steps to Transform Any Industry, and their latest, and the conversation will revolve today around their book, No Fear, No Failure, 5 Principles for Sustaining Growth Through Innovation. She serves on boards of privately held companies and the Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Advisory Board at Columbia Business School. She teaches at the Wharton School and Yeshiva University. Welcome to the show, Lorraine. I'm so glad that you're here.
Well, thank you for having me, Kevin. I'm honored, really looking forward to our conversation.
So let's start here, since we're talking about a book, a really good book. I really enjoy the book. But let's start here. From your perspective, what's the big idea of the book?
Well, the big idea, Kevin, is that despite the fact that, as you mentioned in your opening, so many people, so many organizations say that innovation is the lifeblood of the company, of its growth, of its success, 95% of CEOs surveyed said they do a lousy job of it. And I decided that that was a question worth pursuing, particularly since I had some colleagues ask me, what can I do in my organization to help foster more innovation, more growth? We're not doing a very good job. How can I help? And so that led me to study the topic further, to tap into my own experience, and to interview 120 senior executives across industries and across the globe to see what I could learn in kind of a crowdsourcing format that I could share with you and your listeners.
An innovative way to come up with a book, everybody. So she writes a book called The Innovation Mindset. That's why people are asking her this other question, this really important question about like why the gap, right? So let's talk about in the big picture. Why does this disconnect? I mean, we're going to get into some of the details in the book, of course, but from a big picture perspective, why is it that there is this disconnect where everyone says we want it, and yet 95% of CEOs say we're not doing it?
Well, Kevin, we can tackle that question at an individual, a team, and an organizational level. So you're asking for the macro picture.
Yeah,
I would say, yeah, I would say what happens more often than not in large organizations is that they want the benefit of innovation to drive growth, but they're not willing to do the hard work to create a culture, an operating system, values, behaviors, a whole system with which innovation can flourish. And the main problem is that they create an environment where it's not okay to fail, to experiment, to learn. And in my research, that is what it all boils down to. If we don't have an environment where it's okay to fail because we view failing as experimentation and learning, that's the kiss of death for innovation.
So two things about what Lorraine just said, everybody. Number one is so some of you are saying, yeah, the organizations, they should figure this out. They want it and they should do all the hard work. I would just say to all of us, there's a lot of things we all want that we're not willing to do the hard work on either. So I think it's worth noting that. And the second thing I want to note here is that everybody, Lorraine, my observation is that everybody, and that's a lot of people, right? Everybody will say, man, we learn from our mistakes. And yet we don't want people to actually make mistakes. Like, we know it's profoundly true. And yet we label mistakes and failure as bad, which is begins to unfurl all the stuff that we're going to talk about today. And I think, and I also love that you said that we could talk about the disconnect at the organizational level as well as at the individual or team level. And for those of you listening, that's a sort of a piece of what I'm trying to bring you every episode is a look at leadership for yourself. Some episodes much more about that than others, but also like, what's the organizational story here? What do we need to be thinking organizationally? So sort of the big picture as well as the individual picture. So I love that. And I know we're going to get to some of the individual stuff as well, but I want to stay at the organizational level for another sec, because one of the things in the book that I think is extremely insightful is the fact that you say, from an innovation perspective, there's basically 4 kinds of organizations. So I'd like you to outline them. I'll put them on the screen for those that are watching, but I'd like you to outline them because, and as every one of you are listening, I want you to which one is us? Like, where are we among these 4 things? You want to do that? Let's start there.
Oh, I love that. People have a lot of energy around what I call these innovation organizational archetypes, a lot of syllables just to say these are the personas or the profiles that a lot of organizations fit into. So as you can imagine, we start with the startup mindset, an early stage company trying to get themselves up and running with a new product. And we think of them as very, very innovative. The second one is going to be more of an emerging or the adolescent stage where maybe we're coming out of the startup gates, but we really haven't figured out how to systematize and develop processes and make innovation part of our DNA, if you will. The third one is the sweet spot. So we might call that the emerging or the growth-oriented company that's right at the heart of being innovative, small and nimble enough to make great decisions, but also just enough scale and process and consistency that they can repeat the experience. And then finally, the one we all have probably had some experience with, the corporate behemoth, the bureaucracy can't get out of its own way. Quarterly earnings seem to shut down a lot of creative thinking. And that's our fourth archetype.
So as I was reading through those, I had two thoughts, and so I'll share them and you can comment or say I'm wrong, which happens a lot for me. But the first one is that the adolescent doesn't necessarily mean they're a teenager in terms of, I mean, you're using sort of the idea of, we're really starting to grow up. I think there's a lot of organizations been around a very long time that are really here. They really kind of wanna, but they can't really get out of their own way, which is different than the behemoth that you described. But the thing about this stodgy old bureaucracy, as you call it in the book, that doesn't have to be a huge company either. So my two observations were, one is stodgy, old, and bureaucratic doesn't have to mean huge. Could be us in much smaller form. And this idea of being that up and comer doesn't only mean we've been at this business for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. Thoughts about either of those comments?
Well put, Kevin. My research showed that those categories are not chronologically related to age from an innovation standpoint. And so what I mean by that is, in that stodgy bureaucracy type of bucket, you might place a 150-year-old company like an Ecolab, like a Veolia, that actually has a lot of the spirit and the innovation drive and DNA of more of your startup. You could see a startup that, I come out of the pharma industry. And so you might have a startup where the venture capitalists have decided to bring in an ex-pharma team. And on day one, because it's filled with corporate executives, they're not doing anything in a startup fashion at all from innovation mindset, because they're all bringing a lot of corporate heaviness and process with them. So there's no chronological meaning to that, those different definitions, but it's very true that emerging mindset, that emerging company, that third one, that growth oriented one, even though it's devoid of chronological age, that's a sweet spot that everybody is aspiring to. Again, that intersection of innovation, creativity. It's safe to experiment. We encourage learning. In fact, we value continuous learning, but at the same time, we have enough scale, processes, our operating system is developed enough that we know how to make sure that innovation is something that we do on a repeated basis and it's inculcated in the culture. So that's the place most companies want to be.
And so we're going to spend the rest of our conversation about how we can move in that direction. And so let's go back to something you said earlier about, we can think about this organizationally. And I really hope as an audience that you're, as a listening audience, that you're thinking about that. But you also may say, hey, Lorraine, I'm a frontline leader. I've got a team of 9 people. How does this fit for my team? So can you just say a little bit about that before we sort of get into what the barriers are and how can we move past them at any level?
Well, so as a team leader, one of your obligations is to create an environment that brings out the most in your folks. You want high performing teams. You want creativity. You want people to feel comfortable bringing new ideas to the fore. And so for a leader, it's important that you come up with the rituals, the practices, the incentives around behaviors that work for your team. So let me give you an example. When I was at IBM Watson, in the big behemoth category of companies, as a leader within that organization, I had what I called fail-free Fridays. I convened my senior team and we would have a 30-minute conversation about what wasn't working. Not with an aim to solve any problems, but just to make it okay for colleagues to come around the table, talk about what wasn't working so that we could have honest discussions. And that was one of those rituals that I put into place so that it was very clear and obvious to folks that I valued conversations about failure. We viewed them as experimentation, and we wanted to talk about them as a team. And I hoped that the leaders would inculcate that spirit in their own team meetings and in their own ways of dealing with their teams. So there are small things like that, no matter what kind of organization you're in, that you can start to create as rituals, practices as a leader on your team.
Okay, so I love that in so many levels, but I need to dive into that specific example for a second. So I have two thoughts. Number one is, how hard was it to keep people from wanting to go to solution? And did you really keep them from going there? Like, talk a little bit, because I'm sitting here thinking about that as a leader. I'm sure others are too. Like, how did you keep them from going to trying to go to solving?
Yeah, great question. Well, one thing was because we only have 30 minutes, we didn't have a lot of time for solving it. So, to some extent, you've got to constrain it with the question and the time. And so, yes, I was very keen on saying we got 30 minutes. So-and-so has volunteered that they're going to share a problem with us. We can ask questions around the problem. We can find out why it's occurring. We'll explore everything that we can about it, but we're not here to solve it. Now, that doesn't mean that the team isn't going to get together separately to have a conversation with Sue about solving it. But our goal was not to try to solve it there. It's just to try to uncover the fact that we have this problem. And the reason it was so important just to really shed the light on the problem and all of its facets and stakeholders that were involved and get into all the messiness is because in large companies, it's so much the proclivity to take messy things and shove them under the carpet, right? Pretend like they'll go away, can do thinking, we're too big to fail. And so I needed to pull all that stuff out of under the carpet, bring it into the light, and just get people into the habit of talking about it.
Yeah, I love that. So the other thing that came up for me as you were talking about your 30-minute fail-free Friday meeting, which I'm gonna have a hard time saying, but I love the idea of, is what if, or so did it ever happen? Or if someone implements it and they don't get anyone to share something? In other words, if there's really a fear, they may not want to share the failure. What would you say if that happens, or if people are worried about that happening?
Well, that's a really good point. And when you start something like this, clearly you have to make it safe for the leaders that are going to come forward. They have to have what we call that psychological safety zone. So we had to have some ground rules and a little bit of governance around this. It's a safe zone. Nothing that we talk about under this cone of silence goes outside of, the room unless we have.
It's Las Vegas. What
Yeah.
happens here stays here, right?
Yeah, so well, obviously we didn't try to hide it, but we tried to say, look, this is a safe zone. We're going to keep what we discuss among us. We'll have other opportunities to talk about action plans and solutions and where we go with this, but it's got to be a safe place. And at the beginning, I did need to reach out to people on my team saying, you know what, we just struggled with, let's say it was a customer delivery problem, or, it was something with a data or a solution or software, something in the business unit. We're going to talk about this. I want you to just share what happened with everybody for the benefit of learning. So once I got people to feel comfortable with that, I called them and we discussed it. Everybody found that it was a safe zone. Then people were much more willing. And actually they started looking forward. I would get people writing to me saying, can I please have the 30 minutes? Yeah, because I just had something that happened with my sales team and I'm like still scratching my head over it. And it would really help me to process in a safe space what happened, like, especially since we're not going to try to solve it. I'd like to share this with my colleagues.
I love that because I often say, Lorraine, that thoughts are fuzzy, words bring clarity. So the fact that someone gets to talk about it to other people starts to solve it already because they get clearer about what really is going on. I love that the idea of sort of I'm preceding it, like I'm setting it up so that we don't walk in the room and no one's going to say anything. And the only thing I would add to this is that if we as the leader are willing to share our failures. Others are going to be way more likely to share theirs. Right?
Yes. Great point, Kevin. And I will say that I think the first two, at least, in this particular situation that I'm thinking about, because I still do it, but the first two sessions, I did bring my failures to the group and showed them how this was going to work. So you're right. You've got to be willing to model it in order to really be authentic about having people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and their experiences.
So at the start of the show, before the conversation, I promised that we were going to talk about, okay, what are the barriers? What are the reasons why we have this disconnect between our stated goal of innovation and actually getting innovation out the door? And it comes down to the core of the book. And I want to spend the rest of our time in this conversation about what you call the 5 C's, that these 5 things, like a good consultant, Lorraine, they all start with the same letter. And I can say that because I do that all the time. But the 5 C's, let's talk about those in terms of what they are. I'm going to ask we'll dive into a couple of them, but just give people an overview of the 5 real quick.
Sure. So the first one has to start with culture. And culture is all about setting up an environment where we experiment, we replace failure with experimentation and learning. Our second one is going to be customer first, because really difficult to be an innovative, forward-leading company if you're not putting the customer first. Too many companies talk about the customer, but then they go into the echo chamber. They practice inside-out thinking. Guilty as charged. We think we know what's best for the customer. The third one is one of my favorites. I call it chance, but it's focused on how much we invest in risk. And this goes back to the golden ratio of kind of that magic 10% that we need to be investing in breakthroughs, innovation, transformation, things that we don't know how they're going to turn out, because a lot of times that's what's driving 70% of new growth 5 years later. There's also an important corollary to invest in your team and give them the latitude to try. We certainly have a C around collaboration. And I like to say that collaboration is no longer a behavior that we incent that's about getting along with your peers and being likable. It's a strategic business imperative. And business grows when functions and departments, services, and stakeholders all come together around a common objective and around the customer, all aligned and moving in the same direction, breaking through their silos. And then finally, change, because all of this is underpinning the fact that if we're going to create this positive culture, we've got to be willing to lead the team through change. And so I've got some tips and techniques on how you can make change much more amenable and easy for the team. One of them is delete something first, right? People get overwhelmed when all you do is pile up the bright, shiny objects on their desk, tell them how excited they're supposed to be that they've got one more project for innovation, and yet they're trying to see through, what are my priorities? How am I going to get this big list done? So take something off of the plate and help your teams reprioritize so everybody can focus on that one thing you want to do really well, that's new and cool and very exciting. So those are the 5 C's in a very brief overview.
Well done. So I want to talk about several of them, but that last thing is so important. That, I mean, I suppose someone could be listening and saying, oh, we got 20 minutes in before we talked about change. Innovation has to be related to change, and it does. And that's really not where I want us to spend the few minutes that we have left, because I think people get that at some level. But the point that you just made might be the thing that is what people will take from this conversation, which is we can't just keep adding. I recently had a conversation with someone who said, in a similar conversation, was saying, it's like the picture of the plate at Thanksgiving. And if you're not from the United States, it's the plate at when you're having a feast, right? And the plate is so full, and there's something else you want. Where are you going to put it? There's no place to put it. The only way you can do that is if you have less mashed potatoes. Like, unless you take off some mashed potatoes, there's not room for the brownie, or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is, right? So, like, that is a critical thing, and I am guilty with my team of that, and I am guilty with myself of that. It's incredibly important, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I want to go back to the customer first one, and I'm going to read you something you said in the book, because I thought it was profoundly true. You can comment on it as you choose. You said on page 49, I'm not going to It's not a test. On page 49, you said customer first doesn't mean asking the customer to tell you what you should do. Because I think sometimes that's what we like. That seems like the magic bullet. Like if they would just tell us, then we can go figure that out, and we ought to be able to sell them that.
Yeah, exactly. And the customer really has no clue about your business or your competition or what your offering is. And so it's putting a heavy weight on them to tell you what to do. And so I like to say that the first and most fundamental question in customer research is, first of all, to know who your customer is. And I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but I can't tell you how many times I sit down with the team and I ask that fundamental question and we're still discussing it 4 hours later. Okay, because you might have various stakeholders, various customers, a decision maker who doesn't manage the purse strings. And so it's really important to understand who the customer is. And then you also need to break down what is it they're currently doing? What is their work that is not going well, that's not satisfying, where I think I can intervene and offer them some kind of a change or solution? But I have to observe the customer. I have to have evidence of what they're doing before I can know where I might be able to intervene and change something for them. So I have 6 fundamental questions that are all about understanding the customer before you ever ask them what they need or what they think of your idea. Those are like questions 7 and 8, Kevin.
Yeah, and those questions are all on page 32. So when you all order your book, see right there, they're right there. And so when you order your copy, you can just make a mental note. You want to go to page 32. So when I think about your 5 C's, I know I am told by my team often that, Kevin, you're not normal, but they also say, Kevin, you're not a normal reader, because 537 episodes, about 520 of those ish have been interviews with people like you, which means 520 books, not counting all the others. And so my point is that if you read much of anything in the business press, you're going to hear words like culture. You can see a whole bunch of episodes here about culture, about collaboration, about change, about customer. But that other C of chance might be and that isn't meant, by the way, Lorraine, to discount any of those other 4 in the context of creating the innovation we want and need. I don't mean that at all. And the interconnections between them are all super important. But the thing that people won't have read as much about is this idea of chance. I mean, take us into that as it relates to risk taking and as it relates to how do we really start to think about how we invest that time? What does that look like, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I like to say, think about your own personal finances. If you are so fortunate enough that you're able to invest your own money in the market, you don't put all of your funds into one stock or maybe even into the public market. You have a diversified portfolio. You have things that are going to pay dividends immediately. You have things that are for the medium term. And you might even have things that are very high risk that you don't expect to get a return for maybe 10 or 15 years. And corporations need to think about investing in the same way. And so what the golden ratio says is that you invest about 70% in core. That's to keep your basic business moving forward. You invest another 20% in adjacencies, market expansion, maybe some new customers. And then you save 10% where you invest in net new stuff, right? This is the area where we're not exactly sure what it's going to pan out, but we know we need to look around corners, get ahead of the game, and make some investments. And Sergey Brin said it beautifully, because this was the algorithm that he used at Google. And he showed that 10% that he invested in innovation 5 years later was where 70% of the company's new growth was coming from. And in my research, I found, and I actually interviewed 120 executives on this question, that the companies that sustain growth, that have breakout growth, follow some kind of similar algorithm. Maybe not precisely. If you're in software, your algorithm might be a little different than you're in retail, but they think about it in a similar type of way. and that algorithm really does play through. And I like to say that the corollary for that is also investing in your teams. So we have to make sure that the teams are staffed, resourced, given some latitude, and have some incentive, because that's where you're going to get the new ideas from. They're not going to just fall from the sky. We've got to take that chance of investing. We've got to marry that up with investing in the team, and then creating that environment where they can bring the new ideas forward, and then investing in them. And some of the best companies that I met with showed how they brought the employees into that algorithm. So, they might stage contests. You could, represent an idea. And then at the end of the year, certain of those different ideas or solutions would make their way through into new products. So there's a way that you bring these two together, the financial investment, the resources, and create a really nice ecosystem where people can work and flourish and see that their ideas contribute to the company's top line.
Which takes us back to culture and collaboration. And honestly, sometimes your line folks are the ones who really understand the customer better than the people sitting in that room for 3 hours trying to tell us who the customer is. That's a whole nother conversation, isn't it, Lorraine? Hey, before we go, I've got a couple things I want to ask you. And one of them, is there anything, by the way, that I didn't ask that you really wish I would have, or that you'd like us to talk about for a minute or two?
I just want to encourage your audience. If anything is holding you back at an individual level, you feel intimidated to innovate, you feel afraid of bringing a new idea forward, I hope that you've heard something here between Kevin and myself that will inspire you to just step out of your comfort zone, put a new idea forward. And as I tell my students, if you're in an organization that doesn't value innovation and doesn't want to hear your new ideas, that's something that you should know. And maybe it's something that you need to act on. Do you want to be in a company that doesn't encourage innovation, that doesn't want to hear your ideas, that doesn't want you to develop, and doesn't want you to help the company to develop? So spend a little time reflecting on that. But please make a change if something is holding you back. Try in some small way for yourself and for your team. Start something like a fail-free Fridays if you would be so willing to do so.
So before we go, Lorraine, I have two more questions for you. One is this: the only one you knew for sure I was going to ask you. Like, what are you reading these days?
Well, one of the books that I'm reading, Kevin, is called Invisible Women. And the reason that I'm reading it is because we're definitely square in an era of data and AI. And the book's premise is that a lot of what AI is operating off of, obviously, is published data. And that in many situations, data, if we look over time, is absent of a female perspective or information on women. So not to over index on it, but I found it really interesting to think about what is absent in data that AI is now programmed to report on, which could be the next bastion for innovation and change that we need to think about. Because if we're this reliant on AI and the information that it's giving us, but it's only as good as its data sources, what do we want to do to kind of reconcile that? So I think that's an interesting thing to probe, the data sources that AI sits upon.
We'll have Invisible Women and No Fear, No Failure linked in the show notes, so you can get to your copy, no problem. And I have to say, this might be a record in the last 6 months that we went 30 minutes before the letters AI were said. Before we go, the other question: where do you want to point people if people want to get connected with you and learn more? Obviously, we'll link people to the book, but where do you want to point people or send people? How can people connect with you?
Well, I'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn. So Lorraine Marchand on LinkedIn, and I'd love to have debate and discussion there. I have a website, and it's lorrainemarchand.com. So please get in touch in those couple places, and I'd love to hear some of your ideas and thoughts and other ways that I can encourage and inspire you to get out there and innovate.
Both of those two places are two other places where you can find links to you can get your copy. We've had people here on the live saying, hey, I'm going to order my copy. I hope that you do the same. So everybody, the question, and Lorraine really got at this a second ago already, but the The question that I always ask you, I must ask you again, and that is, now what? You spent 30 minutes with Lorraine and I as we talked about innovation and why we don't always get what we want in innovation in our organizations or our teams. The question is, what did you take? Can you take from this that you will do something with? Because if you don't take action, what's the point, right? Knowledge is only powerful if we act on it. And so it's my hope that you will do that today. And it's my hope that you, of course, will come back again. But before we say goodbye, Lorraine, thank you for being here. Such a pleasure to have you.
Well, Kevin, you promised that we were going to have a fun, lively conversation, and we did. So my thanks to you.
I always like to live up to my promises. I'll say you're welcome, and thank you, Lorraine, as well. So everybody, if you found this useful, number one, take action on what you learned. And number two, make sure you're subscribed so you'll come back next week to join us again for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you then.